Picture yourself backed into a corner, standing on a razor-thin strip of earth. To your left, the ocean is roaring, crashing against the rocks like a beast. To your right, a deadly sheer cliff that drops into nothingness. And staring you down, blocking out the sun, is a wall of Persian soldiers so massive it stretches beyond what the human eye can see. You are looking at an empire of darkness. You have exactly 300 brothers by your side. The opposition numbers in the hundreds of thousands, a swarm of locusts coming to devour the land. In your spirit, you already know the truth. You are not walking out of this valley alive. This is Thermopylae, the site of the most legendary last stand in the history of mankind. It was a moment in time where flesh, bronze shields, and undeniable spiritual willpower acted as the only dam holding back a flood that threatened to wash away an entire civilization. But here is the deception when it comes to legends and myths. They only show you the highlight reel. They show you the blood-soaked finale, the glorious sacrifice, the cinematic climax. They never pull back the curtain to show you the darkness, the trauma, and the twisted system that manufactured the man standing at the very front of that line. You see, Leonidas was not just some noble hero born with courage flowing through his veins like water. He was not the calm, philosophical king that Hollywood and the movies sold you. That is a lie. This man was engineered. He was forged in the fires of a society that was so paranoid, so terrified of its own population, that it turned the raising of children into a form of psychological and physical warfare. You have to understand, Sparta was nothing like Athens. There were no open forums for debate, no marble academies for learning, no poets sipping wine in the shade of olive trees discussing the meaning of life. Sparta was a militarized compound, a fortress carved directly into the jagged rocks of Laconia. It was a place where a tiny elite 1%, the so-called equals, ruled with an iron fist over a massive population of enslaved black earth people known as the Helots. The disparity was staggering. These enslaved people outnumbered their masters by margins that defied logic, sometimes 7 or 10 to 1. And because of this imbalance, every single day, the Spartan elite lived with one suffocating, terrifying truth hanging over their heads like a sword. They knew that if the Helots ever woke up, if they ever unified and realized their own power, Sparta would be wiped off the map overnight. So out of fear, they built a demonic system designed to produce cold-blooded killers. They called it the agoge. Boys were ripped from their mother's arms at 7 years old, mere babies, and thrown into a machine of organized suffering that lasted for over a decade. Starvation wasn't just a circumstance, it was government policy. Violence was the entire curriculum. Any sign of emotional attachment or love was seen as a defect that had to be purged from the soul. There was no warmth, no softness, no room for individual thought or identity. There was only the collective, only the mission, and only the brutal instinct to survive at all costs. And around the year 540 BC, a young boy who had zero expectation of ever sitting on the throne was fed into that meat grinder. He was a third-born son of royalty, meaning there was no crown waiting for him, only the trenches. His name was Leonidas. And let me tell you, the thing that emerged on the other side of that process was not a man built for peace or diplomacy. This was someone who had been forced to watch his own brothers spiral into ruin, a survivor who had endured years of calculated brutality designed to strip away his humanity. He endured freezing nights with absolutely no shelter days on end, with no food in his belly forcing him to steal or hunt just to see the sunrise. All of this was underscored by the ever-present awareness that Sparta was a powder keg sitting on top of a lit fuse, waiting for the oppressed to rise up and burn it all down. So, when Xerxes, a man who blasphemously called himself the King of Kings, began assembling the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever witnessed to punish the West for the humiliation at Marathon, Leonidas was exactly the kind of weapon of mass destruction that Sparta needed to unleash. He was a tool sharpened for this specific hour of judgment. And when a corrupted oracle, likely paid off or compromised, delivered a demonic prophecy stating that either Sparta itself would be reduced to ash or a Spartan king must die, Leonidas received that message the way he was programmed to receive everything. He took it as a direct command. There was no hesitation, no negotiation, no prayer for a different outcome. Thermopylae was never an accident or a strategic blunder. It was the inevitable conclusion of a life built on extreme discipline, deep-seated paranoia, and the ultimate blood sacrifice. Before we step into the fire of that narrow pass and witness 300 men choose death over submission, I need you to drop a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from in this world. Represent your city and your nation. And if you have not joined this movement yet, take 1 second to hit that subscribe button right now. Help us keep exposing the hidden history that the mainstream tries to bury. You are watching the ultimate source for dark history and truth. Long before the shadow of Persia ever stretched across the waters toward the west, Sparta was already fighting a war. But this enemy wasn't some distant kingdom across the sea. The enemy was right there, living underneath their feet in their own backyard. You had a tiny class of full citizens, the homoioi, sitting on top of a massive seething population of helots, enslaved laborers bound to the soil of Laconia and Messenia, working the land for masters who despised them. In some regions, these captive workers outnumbered their Spartan oppressors 10 to 1. Think about the psychological weight of that reality. Every single meal the Spartans ate, every grain of wheat stored in their warehouses was harvested by helot hands, hands that yearned for freedom. And every single morning, the Spartans woke up with the gnawing fear that if those same hands ever put down the shovel and picked up a spear, the entire Spartan world would be erased before the sun went down. So Sparta chose terror as its primary tool of government, and nothing demonstrated that demonic strategy more clearly than the institution known as the Crypteia. On the surface, historians might describe it as a kind of secret police force, but in practice, let's call it what it was: a state-sponsored death squad run by teenagers. Young Spartans barely old enough to grow a beard were handed daggers and given minimal rations, then turned loose. They were sent into the countryside with one job: to hunt. But they weren't hunting deer or boars. They were hunting human beings. They were hunting the helots. Any helot who looked too strong, too confident, or too capable of becoming a leader was marked for death. The Crypteia struck at night without warning and without any trial. It was a system designed to cull the strong and keep an entire population too traumatized and terrified to even think about resistance or rebellion. And it doubled as training for the oppressors. Those boys learned how to move in silence, how to kill without a second thought, and how to carry the heavy weight of shedding innocent blood before they ever stepped onto a legitimate battlefield. This was the nightmare world waiting for a boy named Leonidas around the year 540 BC. He wasn't the son of some anonymous foot soldier. He was born into the Aegead dynasty, one of the 2 royal houses that ruled over this broken system. Sparta had a dual kingship system unlike any other state in Greece, a structure built on checks, balances, and deep suspicion. Back in the ancient days, the power structure was set up with a very specific, almost demonic intelligence. You had 2 kings ruling at the exact same time, coming from 2 distinct bloodlines designed to keep a heavy check on one another so that no single man could rise up and seize absolute godlike dominion over the people. On paper, the historians will tell you this was a safeguard against tyranny, a primitive form of checks and balances. But if you look at it through the lens of reality, it was a machine engineered to generate constant rivalry, deep-seated suspicion, and the kind of friction that keeps the elites at the top fighting while the people stay under control. And let me tell you, in the city-state of Sparta, carrying royal DNA was not a ticket to a soft life. It didn't mean luxury or comfort. It meant you were under the microscope. It meant scrutiny. It meant the weight of impossible expectations and being watched by the public eye every single day of your existence. Now look at the lineage of Leonidas. His father, King Anaxandridas II, brought several sons into this world. The firstborn was Cleomenes, the designated heir to the Aegead throne, the one the system had chosen to take the mantle. Because Cleomenes was marked by destiny, to wear the crown, the traditions of the time actually shielded him. They protected him from the full raw brutality of the Spartan training system, keeping him safe from the fire that forged real warriors. The reasoning behind this was both practical and ruthless, a logic that the ruling class has used for thousands of years. You do not risk breaking the spirit or the body of the boy who is legally bound to lead your armies into the slaughter. You protect the asset at all costs. So, Cleomenes was raised with a velvet glove. Sure, it was still Spartan, still harder than anything we see in the soft generation of 2026, but he was spared the trauma, the absolute worst of what the agoge was designed to inflict. Then you had Dorius, the second son in line. There was no such hedge of protection for him. He was thrown into the meat grinder, tossed into the beast system right alongside the commoners and the rejects. He trained until he collapsed, he bled, he starved. He froze in the winter winds, and he endured every punishment designed to strip a boy down to his core. Essence and rebuild him as a living weapon of war. He came out the other side fierce, absolutely dangerous. But he was also proud, arrogant, and filled with a burning contempt for an older brother who had never walked through the valley of the shadow of death to earn what he was about to inherit. And then seemingly out of nowhere, there was Leonidas, the third son, the one nobody had a plan for, the one the prophets didn't see coming. Under normal circumstances, in the natural order of things, he would have spent his life as just another soldier, maybe rising to a commander but never a king. He was the stone that the builders rejected, and that status sealed his fate in the most powerful way possible. At the age of 7, just like every other boy whose family expected him to become a full citizen of the state, he was snatched from his home and delivered straight into the jaws of the agoge. His mother could not save him. The maternal bond was severed by the state. His royal name meant nothing within those walls. The city swallowed him whole. You have to understand, the agoge was not a school. It wasn't a training camp in the modern sense where you go home on weekends. It was a years-long social experiment in controlled suffering. These boys were divided into packs like wolves and housed in communal barracks designed to break their individuality. Every year they received exactly one cloak. That single thin piece of fabric was their only defense against the blistering heat of summer and the bone-chilling frost of the winter months. No shoes to protect their feet, no beds to rest their weary bodies. They slept on rough mats that they had to weave themselves, snapping river reeds with their bare hands. And if they didn't gather enough, they slept on the cold, hard ground. That wasn't a glitch in the program. That wasn't a failure of the system. That was the system working exactly as the architects intended. Food was deliberately kept scarce to keep them in a state of desperation. The boys were given just enough to keep the heart beating, just enough to survive, but never enough to feel the comfort of a full stomach. They were expected to go out and steal to fill the void. Bread, cheese, scraps of meat, anything they could scavenge. If they succeeded without being caught, they ate like kings. If they were discovered, they were beaten savagely by the overseers. Not because theft was considered a sin or morally wrong, but because getting caught was a sign of weakness. It meant you lacked the cunning to survive in a hostile world. The lesson buried inside every empty stomach and every bruised rib was simple and profound. You will learn to take what you need to survive. You will learn to move in the shadows invisibly, and you will never ever open your mouth to complain about your circumstances. The older boys held absolute tyrannical authority over the younger ones. That meant relentless hazing, physical assaults, and psychological domination dressed up as discipline to toughen the mind for the wars to come. The whip was not a punishment reserved for serious crimes or rebellion. It was as much a part of their daily life as breathing air. They held public flogging competitions at the religious shrines where boys were beaten until they collapsed or passed out from the trauma, all while the adults stood by and watched with nodding approval. The entire point of this ritual was to make pain irrelevant. Crying was a mark of shame. Flinching was a disgrace to your bloodline. A true Spartan was expected to absorb the agony of the world in total silence. And right in the middle of this hellscape stood Leonidas. Picture a boy who knows deep down he carries royal blood, the DNA of kings, but he receives no special treatment whatsoever. He is in the mud with the rest of them. No softer bed, no extra rations, no reprieve from the beatings. He is kicked awake before the sun rises, ordered to run until his lungs burn to fight, to wrestle, to obey, without question or hesitation. Many boys shattered under this immense pressure. Some broke physically, their bodies giving out. Others broke mentally, their spirits crushed. They became hollow, obedient shells, capable of following orders like machines, but incapable of independent thought or leadership. But the fragments of history that survive tell us that Leonidas did not break that way. He adapted. He evolved. Where other boys saw only cruelty and hopelessness, he saw a series of tests ordained to be passed. He learned how to move without making a sound, how to fight as an integral part of a unit, how to take orders without harboring resentment, and eventually how to command men with absolute authority. And from all those years of silence and suffering, he developed one quality that Sparta prized above almost everything else: something we have lost in this loud era of 2026 laconism. Laconism was not just a habit of speaking briefly, it was a philosophy weaponized into conversation. It was the art of saying everything by saying almost nothing. Spartans trained themselves to use as few words as possible. Long explanations were seen as a sign of weakness. Emotional outbursts were a sign of failure and lack of self-control. Excuses were beneath contempt. A true Spartan opened his mouth only when his words could hit harder and deeper than a spear thrust. Leonidas absorbed this completely into his spirit. He became the kind of man who could sit through an hour of pointless debate and then demolish every argument in the room with a single piercing sentence. As Leonidas was being forged in the fires of the agoge, transitioning from a raw recruit into a weapon of mass destruction, the demonic hierarchy over the nation was shifting. His father was fading, his time on Earth drawing to a close. The question of who would carry the mantle wasn't just some abstract political debate anymore. It became a critical, urgent crisis. Around 520 BC, the old king Anaxandridas passed away. Cleomenes, the eldest bloodline, seized the throne as Cleomenes I. And on that specific day, the foundational fracture in Sparta's entire control grid was exposed for those with eyes to see. The most powerful man in the state, the head of the serpent, had never actually endured the baptism of fire that defined what it meant to be a true Spartan. Make no mistake, Cleomenes was intelligent. He possessed a wicked brilliance when it came to diplomacy and could unleash devastation in war. But there was a sickness in his spirit. He was erratic, impulsive, and increasingly unstable, like a man tormented by unseen entities. Herodotus documents episode after episode of a king swinging wildly between genius and absolute recklessness, launching military operations without authorization, completely ignoring the chain of command. He was constantly meddling in the internal politics of other Greek cities, trying to play God with the nations, sometimes achieving results that looked miraculous and other times leaving a trail of absolute wreckage. There were dark rumors that he had compromised the spiritual leadership, bribing the oracle at Delphi to orchestrate a coup against the other Spartan king Demaratus. Whether that specific accusation was fact or fiction, the pattern of corruption was undeniable. Cleomenes operated with that elitist mindset we see today, believing that the rules were written for the common man, not for the rulers. Darius watched this unfolding nightmare with a righteous, burning rage. He had bled and suffered through every single brutal stage of the agoge. He had checked every box, endured every beating, and fulfilled every demand of the Spartan system. In his heart, he knew he was the authentic leader, the one who had earned the right to rule by fire. Yet he was forced to bow the knee to a brother he viewed as soft, privileged, and completely unworthy of the crown. That root of bitterness grew until it became unbearable. So, Darius chose the path that the Spartan collective despised the most. He abandoned his post. He gathered a remnant of loyalists, men who saw the truth and sailed away to carve out his own dominion. First, he tried to establish a foothold in Libya. When that venture collapsed, he turned his eyes towards Sicily, desperate to find a territory where he could escape the suffocating shadow of his brother and prove his divine right to rule. But Sicily wasn't empty land. It was already under the dominion of a massive power. The Carthaginian Empire had its claws deep in that island. Darius marched straight into the mouth of the beast. According to the ancient records, he and nearly his entire battalion were wiped out in a catastrophic battle against the Carthaginian forces. The warrior who couldn't stomach submitting to a corrupt brother ended up dying on foreign soil, chasing a phantom throne that was never meant for him. But Leonidas stayed. He didn't run, he didn't try to orchestrate a rebellion or a coup d'etat. He stood his ground, he watched, and he learned. He observed exactly how a compromised king could rot Sparta from the inside out. He saw how pride and impatience led his brother Darius to a meaningless grave. The third son, the backup plan that nobody was paying attention to, was quietly downloading lessons on power, patience, and survival that no drill instructor in the agoge could have ever taught him. This was spiritual warfare training. During these shadow years, he likely served in standard military operations, border patrols, and the brutal suppression of the Helot uprisings. His life wasn't peaceful, it was deliberate. He remained positioned inside the very system that had made him waiting for the divine timeline to align. Then Cleomenes began to spiral in a way that the establishment could no longer cover up. His behavior became extreme, demonic even. He started driving away all their strategic allies. His violence stopped having any logical strategy. It became random chaotic, a manifestation of pure madness. The ephors, those 5 elected magistrates who held the real power to check the kings, began to see him as an existential threat to the stability of the state. Eventually the order was given. They declared him clinically insane. For a Spartan king to be officially labeled as a madman by his own deep state government was the end of the line. Cleomenes was seized, placed in chains, and thrown into a dungeon. The man who had inherited the throne without ever paying the price of the agoge now found himself stripped of all glory, restrained like a rabid animal in front of the very people he used to command. What went down next remains one of the most suspicious and dark chapters in Spartan history. The official narrative claims Cleomenes convinced a guard to hand him a knife. Then, alone in his cell, he supposedly methodically carved his own body apart until he bled out. It paints a picture of total possession and horror. But many historians look at that and see a cover-up. A king that unstable, that dangerous a man capable of dragging the entire nation into ruin would not have been left alone with a weapon by accident. That doesn't happen. It is highly probable that the same system that once propped Cleomenes up decided it was time to liquidate the asset. Whatever the truth is, the outcome was final. The firstborn son was dead in disgrace, his legacy erased. The second son was long gone a pile of bones on a Sicilian battlefield, and when the smoke cleared, there was only one man left standing. Around 490 BC, Leonidas, the quiet survivor, the product of every hard lesson Sparta had to offer, ascended to the throne. He didn't win it through ego or ambition. He didn't seize it through backroom conspiracies. He simply outlasted the corruption and the pride ahead of him. And his timing, it couldn't have been more critical. That same year, the Persian king Darius I launched a massive expedition to punish Athens and its allies for daring to support the Ionian revolt. The enemy was at the gates. The Persians landed at Marathon. The Athenians were staring down the barrel of annihilation. You have to look back at the history to understand what's coming. We had this small, gritty contingent from Plataea linking up with the Athenian lines, and against all odds they charged right into the belly of the beast. They didn't just push back the Persian war machine, they completely shattered the narrative of invincibility. By every metric of warfare, that victory should have been impossible. It defies logic. But instead of a defeat, it transformed into the most celebrated military triumph in the history of Athens. It was a miracle moment. For Athens, the Battle of Marathon was the wake-up call, absolute proof that the power of the Persian Empire could be broken. But for Persia, it was more than a loss. It was an unforgivable humiliation that stained their legacy. Darius took a blood oath for revenge. He swore he would burn it all to the ground. But we know that the Most High determines the timeline, and death claimed him before he could assemble that second invasion force. So the mantle passes to his son Xerxes. This man inherited a throne that stretched all the way from the Indus River to the shores of the Aegean. And along with that power, he inherited his father's unfinished demonic rage. You need to understand the psychology here. For Xerxes, Marathon wasn't just a tactical defeat on a map. It was a personal insult to his god complex and a direct challenge to the empire itself. Over the next few years, he started assembling something the ancient world had never witnessed before. This was the mobilization of a global superpower on a scale that defies imagination. We are talking about a military force of such staggering magnitude that it was aimed directly at the heart of Greece, intended to wipe out the concept of freedom entirely. While Xerxes is out there stockpiling fleets, conscripting soldiers from dozens of subject nations and building bridges across the sea to defy nature itself, something else was happening in the West. Leonidas was governing Sparta, but he was doing it in a manner completely unlike the puppet leaders before him. He was steady, he was measured, he was a man of law and order in a time of chaos. He didn't play political games. He cooperated with the ephors instead of trying to manipulate the system. His training forged him into a leader who was both cautious and decisive, a rare combination we desperately need today. Listen, Sparta didn't need a gambler or a high roller. They needed a king with a backbone of steel, someone who wouldn't lose his nerve when faced with impossible odds and the end of his world. And you have to realize Leonidas wasn't operating in a vacuum. The Spartan women were built different. They received an education that was almost unheard of in the rest of the ancient Greek world. These women were expected to be physically dominant, intellectually sharp, and completely unafraid to speak the truth to power. They were the backbone of the resistance. Leonidas' wife, Gorgo, was legendary even in her own time. She possessed an intelligence and a spirit of discernment that allowed her to see things others missed. There is a specific account preserved by Herodotus that demonstrates exactly how critical she was to the survival of her people. It's a lesson for all of us in this hour. There was a Spartan exile living right in the Persian court, almost certainly the deposed king Demaratus operating behind enemy lines. He saw the signs. He needed to warn Sparta that Xerxes was preparing a massive invasion, a total reset. But sending that message openly, that was a suicide mission. If the Persian intelligence agents intercepted it, Demaratus would be executed on the spot. So he devised a method to bypass the censors. He took a writing tablet and scraped off all the wax. He carved his warning directly into the wood underneath the hidden truth beneath the surface. Then he recoated it with fresh wax so the tablet appeared completely blank. When that tablet arrived in Sparta, the officials who examined it were completely baffled. They were looking with natural eyes. There was no visible message. They suspected it was a trick, a prank, or just a meaningless gesture. They couldn't see the reality hidden in plain sight. It was Gorgo who cracked the code. She had the discernment. She told them to remove the wax to look deeper. And beneath it, scratched into the wood, were the words that changed the timeline. Xerxes is coming. That warning only reached Leonidas because one woman refused to accept that something was empty just because it looked that way on the surface. She woke them up. As Xerxes' preparations grew too massive to conceal, he stopped hiding in the shadows. He shifted from covert build-up to open intimidation and psychological warfare. Persian ambassadors fanned out across the Greek world, carrying a single non-negotiable demand: earth and water. These were the ancient symbols of total submission. Offering them meant surrendering your sovereignty, your freedom, and your identity. The message was clear: your land belongs to us, your lives belong to us, you only exist at the pleasure of the King of Kings. It was the ultimate globalist power grab. And the sad truth is, many Greeks surrendered. Thessaly submitted. Cities across the land bent the knee to the beast system because they were afraid. Argos chose mere survival over resistance. Standing up against the Persian Empire seemed like pure madness to the rational mind. Their logic was simple. Why sacrifice your city for an abstract idea like freedom when you could just kneel and continue to breathe under the protection of the most powerful ruler on earth? When those ambassadors arrived in Sparta, they walked in with arrogance and repeated the same demand: earth and water. Submit or die. On the surface, it looked like a straightforward choice. You either submit and live as a slave, or you refuse and face total annihilation. But Leonidas understood something deeper. He knew there were customs and spiritual laws, even in war, that defined who you were. Killing envoys was considered an act of barbarism that crossed a sacred line. It was taboo. Messengers were supposed to be untouchable, the last fragile thread connecting two sides before violence consumed everything. They were the diplomatic safety valve. Sparta severed that thread with spectacular brutality. The story tells us the Persian envoys were brought before the Spartan authorities and made their demand for submission. The Spartans looked them in the eye and told them that if they wanted earth and water from Sparta, they were welcome to collect it themselves. Then they dragged these ambassadors, these agents of the New World Order, to a deep well. There they said, "You will find all the earth and water you need at the bottom," and they threw them into the pit. That was not simply a refusal. It was a deliberate, irreversible provocation. Sparta hadn't just rejected Xerxes. They had declared war on his entire system. They murdered his representatives in a way specifically designed to humiliate him. There was no diplomatic path left after that moment. The bridges were burned. War was now a certainty. The shockwave of this event traveled across Greece. Everyone understood what Sparta had done. They had poked the bear. By killing those envoys, Sparta had guaranteed that Xerxes would come with everything he had. There was no turning back. Fear began to spread like a disease. They knew if the Persian army arrived at full strength and the Greek cities remained divided, every last one of them would be crushed individually. The time of reckoning was here. Representatives from Athens, Corinth, Thebes, and all the other major players gathered together in what you could only call councils of absolute desperation. The atmosphere in those rooms was toxic, filled with arguments and leaders pointing fingers, accusing one another of being cowards, while panic set in like a rot. But beneath all the shouting and the political posturing, there was one cold, hard truth that nobody could ignore. There was only one state in the entire Greek world that had a land army strong enough to stand toe-to-toe with the Persian war machine on open ground, and that was Sparta. Then you had Themistocles of Athens, a man with one of the sharpest strategic minds we have ever seen in history, who stepped up to propose a plan that would change the game entirely. He realized that Greece could not possibly attempt to fight the Persian Empire across every single front at the same time. That was a suicide mission. Instead, the Greek coalition had to be smart. They needed to choose specific choke points, funneling that massive Persian horde into tight spaces where their overwhelming numbers would turn into a logistical nightmare rather than an advantage. Out on the water, the Greek fleet, which was built primarily around those heavy-hitting Athenian warships, was given a very specific assignment. They were tasked with engaging the Persian navy in the narrow straits, forcing them into a corridor where they could not flank or swarm the defenders. Meanwhile, on land, the strategy was to pin down the massive Persian ground force at a bottleneck so incredibly tight that only a tiny fraction of their soldiers could actually fight at any given second. When they looked at the terrain, every single map and every report from the scouts pointed to one location above all others, a place that seemed designed by destiny for this exact moment. Thermopylae, known as the Hot Gates, was a narrow coastal pass, squeezed tight between the steep, unforgiving mountain cliffs and the sea along the northern shore of central Greece. At the tightest sections of this pass, the road was barely wide enough for a handful of men to stand shoulder to shoulder, effectively neutralizing the enemy's size. The thinking was simple. If you could get disciplined, heavily armored Greek hoplites to lock their shields, in that gap you created an immovable object. The Persian army would be forced to feed their soldiers into a meat grinder in small groups, completely stripping away their greatest advantage of mass numbers. The strategy was elegant, simple, and deadly. The goal was to hold that pass just long enough for the Greek fleet to secure a decisive victory on the water, turning the tide of the war. If the fleet could pull that off, the Persian supply lines stretching across the Aegean would be severed, leaving that massive land army stranded in hostile territory with no way to eat and no way to resupply. Leonidas, the king of Sparta, looked at the plan and he understood the logic immediately. He saw the tactical brilliance of using the terrain to fight a giant. But he also understood the grave risk involved, knowing that if Thermopylae fell too quickly, there would be absolutely nothing stopping the Persian flood from pouring into central Greece. Athens would burn to the ground and the Peloponnese would be left completely exposed to the enemy, so he agreed to lead the land force north himself. However, to do this job properly, he knew he needed the full strength and might of Sparta's professional army behind him. He needed the real phalanx, the core fighting force that could hold any line against any demon. So he went to the ephors to request permission to mobilize, and he hit a wall harder than any shield. The timing of this march just happened to coincide with the Carnia, which was one of Sparta's most sacred religious festivals, dedicated to the god Apollo. Spartan law was crystal clear and strictly prohibited launching any major military campaigns, while this festival was taking place no matter what was happening in the world. In their eyes, the gods came first, and violating that rule wasn't just illegal. It was viewed as signing a death warrant by inviting divine punishment upon the state. This was the exact same religious restriction that had nearly prevented Sparta from sending help to Athens before the Battle of Marathon years earlier, and now history was repeating itself. The ephors refused the request, decreeing that the army would stay home. A force large enough to wipe Greece off the map was gathering, and Sparta's own laws had frozen its military in place. On one side of the scale, you had religious duty and tradition. On the other side, you had the survival of everything they had ever built or known. It was a contradiction that could have destroyed them right then and there. But you have to remember that Leonidas was a product of the agoge training. He was not the type of man to waste his energy fighting against immovable obstacles. Instead, he looked for the loophole, the way around the wall. The law specifically prohibited the full army from marching to war, but it said absolutely nothing about the king traveling with his own personal bodyguard unit. Sparta maintained an elite royal guard consisting of 300 hand-picked warriors, the absolute finest soldiers in a state that produced nothing but soldiers. So Leonidas went back to the ephors with a different proposal, telling them he would not mobilize the main army. Instead, he would simply take his 300 men north as an advanced force. Technically, it wasn't a campaign, it was just a scouting mission or a preliminary deployment. The ephors, finding themselves trapped by their own legal framework and terrified of looking like they were doing nothing while Greece burned, approved the request. Perhaps they told themselves that reinforcements would follow once the festival ended, kicking the can down the road to soothe their consciences. But Leonidas almost certainly knew the truth. In his spirit, those reinforcements were not going to arrive in time to save them. He added one final requirement to the mission that reveals exactly what he expected. He stated that only men who already had living sons were eligible to join the 300. On the surface, that sounds like a cold administrative detail. But when you look beneath the surface, it is absolutely devastating and prophetic. Leonidas did not believe these men were coming home, and he wanted to guarantee that every bloodline represented in that force would continue even after the men themselves were dead. This was not a heroic charge designed to win a surprising victory against the odds. This was a suicide mission. It was a calculated sacrifice planned from the very beginning, and the Spartan farewells carried no softness or false hope. Mothers and wives did not collapse in tears, begging their men to stay behind in safety. That was not the Spartan way. Women in Sparta were raised from birth to view cowardice as a fate far worse than death itself, and they held the line just as much as the men did. There is a famous instruction passed down through the generations spoken when a woman placed a heavy bronze shield into a departing warrior's hands. She would tell him, "With it or on it," meaning you either come back carrying your shield in victory or you be carried home dead upon it. There is no third option. Listen, if you dropped your shield just to run a little faster, you weren't just losing a piece of equipment. You were abandoning your spiritual covering and betraying your bloodline. The final moment between King Leonidas and his wife Queen Gorgo illustrates this warrior mindset with a clarity that hurts the modern soft heart. She didn't ask him why the mission was necessary. She looked him in the eye and asked what her orders were for the aftermath once he was gone. His response was surgical, cutting through the emotion, brief, practical, and devoid of the weakness we see today. He told her to find a righteous man and raise up strong offspring. This wasn't a romance novel, it was a command for the survival of the race. If he fell, the nation still needed warriors to hold the line. His own ego and feelings meant nothing. The 300 chosen men gathered in their blood-red cloaks, gripping their bronze shields and spears ready to face the darkness. Stragglers and contingents from the other Greek tribes fell in line behind them, trying to catch the spirit of the Spartans as they marched north toward destiny. But before Leonidas walked into the valley of the shadow of death, he made a critical stop at Delphi to confront the spiritual powers of the age. He went to the most terrifying religious stronghold in Greece to demand answers from the Oracle of Apollo, tapping into the supernatural realm. The high priestess, channeling a spirit from the other side, delivered a prophecy that confirmed the heavy burden Leonidas was already carrying in his spirit. Her words removed any false hope of a rescue. The demonic entity spoke plainly: either the city of Sparta would be wiped off the map by the barbarian horde, or a king from the bloodline of Hercules had to die. The salvation of the people required the blood sacrifice of the king. No amount of clever politics or negotiation could alter this spiritual law. No tactical genius could swap out the requirement. It was blood for survival, a single life given to preserve the entire civilization from slavery. For the average man, hearing a prophecy like that would be a death sentence that would shatter his mind with fear. But for Leonidas, a man programmed by decades of discipline and submission to a higher calling, it was absolute clarity. The confusion vanished. His death wasn't a probability, it was written. It was a divine mandate. Thermopylae ceased to be a military operation and transformed into a ritual altar where the offering would be made. He was walking straight toward his own sacrifice, and he did it with eyes wide open. He led the way as the scattered Greek forces converged on the mountain pass. The massive gap between the promises of the politicians and the reality on the ground became sickeningly obvious to everyone present. On paper, a massive coalition was supposed to rise up and meet them at the hot gates to stop the invasion. But just like we see in current events, fear and political cowardice paralyzed the response. The promised help from the other states evaporated. Some cities sent a handful of token soldiers just to save face, while others delayed, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. When Leonidas finally counted the true patriots standing with him, he had roughly 7,000 men, including his 300 Spartans. It was a suicide mission by the numbers, but it was the only remnant he had. They arrived at the hot gates. The geography was divinely set for this confrontation, sheer cliffs shooting up on one side and the raging sea crashing on the other. It was a bottleneck where the massive numbers of the enemy meant nothing, allowing only a few men to fight face to face at any given second. The ruins of an ancient wall built by the locals in a previous cycle of history still stood there broken and crumbling across the pass. Leonidas gave the order to rebuild the breach and reinforce the barrier immediately. That pile of stones, backed by rows of armored warriors locked in a phalanx, would turn that narrow road into a meat grinder for the enemy. The scouts rode out and came back trembling. What they saw wasn't just an army, it was a beast system on the move. It was a migrating globalist empire. Soldiers harvested from every captured nation under the dominion of Xerxes. You had Medes Persians, Egyptians and fighters dragged from the darkest corners of Asia, cavalry, archers and endless waves of infantry. The supply lines stretched further than the eye could see, filled with servants, engineers, and the bureaucracy of a tyranny on the march. The dust cloud they kicked up was so massive it blocked out the sun like a plague. The ancient historians claimed there were millions of them. Now the modern academics try to downplay it, estimating maybe 200,000 or 300,000, trying to minimize the miracle. But standing on that road, looking into the approaching storm, the exact math didn't matter. It was more power than any human had ever witnessed. The Persian horde finally revealed itself at the far end of the pass, a sea of darkness ready to swallow the light. When Xerxes, the self-proclaimed god king, sat on his throne and looked at the tiny Greek force, he was baffled and enraged. The Spartans weren't panicking, they weren't running for the hills. According to the witnesses, they were totally at peace. Some of them were calmly combing their hair and engaging in pre-battle rituals with total focus. They were preparing for death with the same casual discipline they would use for a morning workout. Xerxes just sat there and waited. He assumed that once the reality of his power sank in, these men would break and scatter like roaches. But they stood their ground. Days went by. Finally, he sent a negotiator with a simple offer: surrender your weapons. Submit to the New World Order. You will be allowed to survive if you kneel. It was the ultimate temptation, backed by the largest military machine in history. Leonidas, a man who spoke only truth, gave the response that should echo in the heart of every patriot in the year 2026. Two words that define the resistance against tyranny: molon labe, come and take them. There was no room for debate, no compromise, no backing down. The line was drawn in the dust and the war was on. Now, before we go deeper into what happened next, I have a critical message you need to hear. If you are still standing with us, if you have walked this rugged path from the very beginning, witnessing the transformation of a stolen 7-year-old child into a sovereign warrior king at the gates of fire, then you are not just scrolling through another feed. You have eyes to see. You are part of the remnant. We have established a covenant community here, something distinct and set apart that we call the lineage. This is not just a digital support button or a membership badge. It is a way to stand in the spirit realm right beside us. The members of the lineage are the prophetic fuel that allows these deep dive investigations to manifest in the physical world. They provide the necessary resources for us to go dark for weeks, excavating hidden truths and vetting every single claim against the historical and biblical record to bring you the unvarnished reality. They are the first to receive the intel, stepping into the inner circle that helps discern which buried timelines and suppressed historical scrolls we are going to unseal for the world next. If that resonates with your spirit, if this gathering feels like the sanctuary you have been searching for in 2026, consider joining the lineage and claiming your rightful place among the tribe. The pagan emperor Xerxes had received his answer loud and clear. He had gazed across that narrow choke point, calculated the odds against the small remnant standing in his way, and arrogantly offered them a counterfeit peace. But Leonidas rejected the compromise with absolute contempt. The self-styled King of Kings turned to his commanders, his face hardened like flint, and released the decree of total war. The time for talk was over. The time for blood had arrived. No more patience, no more diplomacy with the resistance. Unleash the first wave of destruction. That rocky mountain corridor was destined to become a valley of dry bones and fresh blood, and 300 anointed Spartans were planted like oaks of righteousness right in the heart of the coming storm. The initial battalions that Xerxes fed into the meat grinder were nothing more than pawn souls he considered completely disposable for his agenda. He sent the Medes and the Scythians conscripts dragged from broken conquered nations, shoving them forward to test the resolve of the free men holding the line. Their mandate was simple and brutal: march into the teeth of death, crush the wall of resistance, and sweep the defenders away like chaff in the wind. With the terrifying weight of the entire Persian war machine pressing at their backs, not a single soul on the imperial side believed this would be anything other than a quick massacre. They surged forward in thick, suffocating columns driven by the lash of their masters' whips, shields raised and voices howling until they smashed violently against the immovable object of the Spartan phalanx. The pass was tight, a claustrophobic trap, but the Spartans and their allies stood shoulder to shoulder, fused together in a bond stronger than iron. Every man bore the weight of a massive bronze-faced shield, gripped a spear roughly 8 feet long, designed to pierce the soul, and carried a short iron blade on his hip for the intimate work of close-quarters combat. Bronze helmets sealed their faces like death masks, and plates of armor guarded their vital organs. They were not just a mob of brawlers, they were a singular, disciplined instrument of war. And when the Medes slammed into them, it was like flesh throwing itself against a locomotive, a futile collision with a living, breathing wall of bronze and hardened muscle. The front line of warriors locked their shields together, creating a seamless, impenetrable barrier that refused to yield an inch of ground to the enemy. Behind them, the brothers in the second and third rows drove their spears over the shoulders of the men in front, creating a lethal, prickly hedge of death. To the Persian eye, it did not look like men anymore. It looked like a solid monolith of wood and metal, bristling with a terrifying forest of razor-sharp iron points waiting to feast. Their flimsy wicker shields and weak leather armor offered zero protection against such power. The Greek spears punched through faces, throats, and chest cavities with sickening ease before the invaders could even get close enough to strike. Understand this, King Leonidas was not hiding in the safety of the rear guard issuing orders from a comfortable tent. He was right there on the front line, exactly where a true alpha and anointed king is supposed to be crushed into the grinding, suffocating press of humanity. He was baptized in sweat and the blood of his enemies, shouting guttural commands, dictating the violent rhythm of the slaughter like a conductor of death. When the Persian momentum stalled, when fear began to rot the resolve of the attackers, Leonidas unleashed the command that every Spartan had been bred to execute since they were boys. Portrayed. The Athismos. The men in the back ranks drove their bodies forward, channeling every ounce of their God-given strength into the backs of their brothers. That kinetic energy traveled through the armor and shields like a tidal wave of force, and the front rank dropped their shoulders and surged forward to crush the enemy. The Medes were caught in a vice grip, spear points ripping them apart from the front, and the crushing weight of their own army pushing from behind, and they absolutely shattered. The men at the point of contact died instantly on their feet, while those behind them tripped over the fresh corpses and were trampled into the bloody mud. The conscripts further back were blind to the carnage. All they knew was that the great imperial machine had ground to a halt and death was in the air. Their commanders screamed obscenities and beat them with whips to force them onward, herding them step by agonizing step into that narrow corridor of doom. The bodies of the Persian dead piled up so rapidly that they became part of the landscape itself, and the Greeks ruthlessly used the mounds of flesh as high ground. When the muscles of the front rank began to burn with fatigue, Leonidas's warriors executed a tactical shift they had drilled into their subconscious thousands of times. The line rotated with fluid precision. Fresh, energized hoplites stepped into the kill zone, allowing the exhausted fighters to slip to the back to recover their breath. They did this without opening a single crack in their defense. This perpetual cycle kept the Greek wall operating at maximum lethality, while the disorganized attackers had no answer for such discipline. The enemy was simply driven into the meat grinder until they died or their spirits broke in terror. Wave after wave crashed against the rock, and wave after wave was utterly pulverized into dust. Xerxes watched from his golden throne high above, waiting for that inevitable moment when the Greeks would break, drop their shields in panic and run. But that moment never manifested. When the Medes failed, he threw in fresh battalions from other enslaved nations, but the outcome remained identical. The pass was too tight for his numbers to matter. His massive numerical advantage was null and void. All those extra bodies accomplished was choking the battlefield with more corpses for the birds of prey. By the time the sun set and darkness swallowed the valley on that first day, the Persian Empire had gained absolutely zero ground. Hundreds, possibly thousands of their soldiers lay rotting in the dirt of the pass, while the Greek casualties were almost non-existent. The defenders pulled back behind their wall as night settled, not in fear, but with the cool discipline of professionals. They washed the blood from their wounds, hammered out the dents in their shields, and prepared to do it all again. They were honing their edges, iron sharpening iron, just like the scriptures tell us to do. That deep-seated programming, the machine-like discipline drilled into their spirits since they were toddlers, was kicking in exactly when it mattered most in 2026. Now you have to understand the mindset of the enemy. Xerxes, representing that arrogant globalist system, refused to believe this was anything more than a glitch in his matrix. By the second day, he realized his pawns were useless. He stopped feeding the second-rate conscripts into the meat grinder and decided to unleash the demonic elite. He sent in the Immortals. These weren't your average foot soldiers. The Immortals were the deep state's enforcement squad. The crown jewel of the Persian war machine, maintained at a permanent, unshakable strength of 10,000 killers. They earned that name because the system creates them to be replaceable. The moment one drone went down, another was immediately promoted to fill the void, keeping the number constant. They were better equipped, rocking superior armor, and trained far beyond the capacity of the regular Empire infantry. They were the shock troops of the New World Order of their day. They carried a heavy reputation for grinding through any resistance with a relentless, methodical pressure that usually made nations fold out of fear. Backed by a devastating hail of arrows that blotted out the sun, they marched into that narrow pass under their own pagan banners, radiating the false confidence of the wicked. You have to realize these guys had toppled governments across 3 continents. No one had ever stood their ground against this juggernaut for long without breaking. But at Thermopylae, they hit a spiritual brick wall. The terrain was a bottleneck, a narrow gate, if you will, that strangled their ability to deploy their massive numbers. It didn't matter how big their army was. Only the men at the very front could engage the Greeks. It was face-to-face combat in the Valley of Decision. Their wicker shields and scale armor offered a bit more protection than the cloth and leather the Medes wore, but they were no match for the long reach of Spartan truth. The hoplite shields interlocked into an unbroken barrier of brotherhood. Bronze was defeating wicker, solid substance was crushing the shallow defenses of the empire. The Immortals pressed forward in their disciplined ranks, but those Greek spear points found every seam, every weak point in their armor and ripped them wide open. Leonidas, acting like a true shepherd of his people, exploited that moment to absolutely shatter their psychological conditioning. At a critical, calculated point in the brawl, the Greeks executed a feigned retreat, stepping backward in perfect formation as if the line was finally crumbling under the pressure. The Persians took the bait. They surged forward, convinced the resistance had finally broken. Then, on a single shouted command, the hoplites reversed direction and brought the judgment. They slammed their heavy shields into the rushing attackers and drove their spears through the tangled, confused mass of enemy bodies. That sudden reversal turned the narrow road into a slaughterhouse. It was absolute carnage on the floor of that pass. The Immortals were trapped between the spears ahead and their own officers whipping them forward from behind. They fell in heaps, consumed by the very system they served. History tells us that Xerxes leaped from his throne 3 times that day in fury and disbelief. He was watching his most feared soldiers get dismantled by a few thousand awake warriors. Whether every specific detail is literally true or not, the image captures the spiritual reality we are seeing even now. The self-proclaimed King of Kings had committed his finest assets and watched them bleed out in a space too tight for their numbers or their technology to make a difference. By nightfall of the second day, the narrative hadn't changed. The Persian losses were catastrophic and the giant was bleeding. The Greeks were battered, bruised, and exhausted, but the line remained intact. They were still standing on the rock. That narrow pass had transformed the largest army the world had ever seen into a single-file procession of victims being fed one by one into a machine designed to destroy them. Xerxes realized he couldn't win a fair fight. From the front, the phalanx was doing precisely what generations of Spartan training had built it to do: hold the line against tyranny. No frontal assault, no matter how determined, could break through as long as the men behind those shields held their nerve and kept the faith. Then, just like there's always a Judas, someone stepped forward who changed the entire equation without ever lifting a weapon against a single Spartan. His name was Ephialtes, a local man from the region of Malis, a traitor willing to sell out his own people. He wasn't a warrior of any renown, not a politician, just a man who knew the secrets of the mountains and was willing to use that knowledge for evil. He approached the Persian camp with a proposition ready to make a deal with the devil. In exchange for a reward, whether it was gold status or protection, he agreed to reveal a hidden trail that wound over the ridge behind the Greek position. It was an old goat path known to shepherds and locals called the Anapeia path. It was the back door the enemy was looking for. This was exactly the fracture Xerxes had been searching for. If he could send a strike force along that trail and crash down behind the Greek line, Leonidas would be caught between two armies. The phalanx designed to face enemies from one direction would be helpless against an attack from the rear. It's the blind spot. Shields pointing forward could not stop blades and arrows coming from behind. Treachery strikes where you aren't looking. There was absolutely no hesitation. The enemy moves quickly when the door is opened. Xerxes selected a powerful strike force and placed it under the command of a general named Hydarnes. Under the cover of darkness, they led the immortals into the mountain. They moved as quietly as thousands of armored men could manage, creeping through the night like a thief. They picked their way through the forest and rocky terrain, guided step by step by Ephialtes and other locals who were selling out their birthright. Now Leonidas wasn't naive. He knew the side path existed. He had positioned a force of 1,000 Phocian soldiers on the mountain specifically to watch the wall. Their mission was clear and critical. If the Persians attempted to outflank the Greek position, the Phocians were to hold the high ground at all costs. They were supposed to block the trail and prevent any force from descending behind the main army. They were the firewall. But here is the problem. The Phocians were not Spartans. They hadn't survived the agoge. They didn't think the way Leonidas and his 300 thought, and they weren't ready for the sacrifice. As Hydarnes and his massive column ascended through the gloom of the night, the atmosphere shifted. The undeniable sound of boots crushing dry leaves and heavy armor rattling against the rocks traveled ahead of them like a warning from the grave. The Phocians, who were supposed to be the watchmen on the wall, heard the disturbance. They were roused from their sleep not by a vision, but by the terrifying noise of branches snapping and metal clinking in the darkness below them. At first, in their confusion, they may have assumed it was just a small raiding party testing the lines. But as the noise grew, the true scale of the movement became undeniable to anyone paying attention. This wasn't a handful of scouts looking for a way in. Thousands of soldiers were climbing toward them with deadly intent, and a spirit of fear began to spread through the Phocian line like an unquenchable wildfire. Now, instead of standing their ground, locking shields across the narrow path and forcing the Persians to fight an uphill battle against a solid wall of spears, which is the only way to hold the line. Exactly the kind of engagement that would have favored the defenders. Holding the high ground, the Phocians faltered in the moment of truth and pulled back to a more elevated position. They were focused on self-preservation, protecting their own lives, but completely abandoning the lower trail to the enemy. Hydarnes, seeing the opening, had absolutely no interest in fighting them if he could simply bypass them. You have to understand, his objective was not to waste time defeating the Phocians in a skirmish. His singular objective was to flank the main force and get behind Leonidas to cut off the head of the resistance. He left a small screening force behind just to keep the fearful Phocians pinned in place and rendered useless, while he drove the main column forward along the now unguarded path with terrified speed. The trap was closing around the hot gates with mathematical precision, and just before the break of dawn, on that fateful third day, the devastating news finally reached the Greek camp at Thermopylae. A breathless runner arrived first, gasping out the report that enemy forces had been spotted maneuvering through the hills above them, signaling that the betrayal of the geography was complete. Shortly after that initial warning, a deserter from the Persian side, or perhaps another scout bringing intel, confirmed the worst fears of the camp. The guard on the mountain path had failed their assignment. Persian troops were descending like wolves behind the Greek position. And within a matter of hours, the defenders at Thermopylae would have enemies pressing in on them from both the front and the rear. The Greek commanders converged on Leonidas, immediately looking for direction as the reality of their situation began to set in. The defensive plan that had held firm for 2 blood-soaked days, defying the might of an empire, was now falling apart right before their eyes. The options that remained on the table were few, and let me tell you, none of them looked good for the survival of the men in that pass. They could choose to abandon the pass entirely and retreat to the south, but that meant leaving the gate wide open for the enemy to flood in. The entire Persian army would pour through into central Greece like a river of destruction, with absolutely nothing left to slow it down or protect the people. They could attempt a suicide run, trying to break forward through the main Persian line before Hydarnes arrived from the rear to crush them. But the army, standing in front of them, was still enormous, fresh and well-rested, while the defenders were running on fumes, battered and exhausted from days of combat. Or they could choose the unthinkable, stay right there and die where they stood. Leonidas called a solemn council of the allied commanders to make the final call. Representatives from the different Greek cities argued their cases with passion. Some pushed hard for an immediate withdrawal from the trap. They insisted that saving the surviving soldiers for future battles made more strategic sense than throwing their lives away in a past that could no longer be held against such odds. Others argued with equal fervor that every man should stay and fight to the last breath, buying as much time as possible for the rest of the nation to wake up and prepare. Both positions had merit in the natural, but the reality was that Thermopylae was no longer a viable defensive position. It was rapidly transforming into a cage of death. But Leonidas carried the heavy weight of the Delphic prophecy in his mind. He knew the spiritual equation was that either Sparta would be destroyed or a Spartan king would have to die. If he retreated now, he might save his own life and the lives of his men for a season, but he would be surrendering the pass to the enemy. And worse than that, he would shatter the symbolic stand that Thermopylae had already become across all of Greece, breaking the spirit of the resistance. The Persian army would march through unopposed, and the story that spread from city to city would be simple and devastating to the morale of the people. The report would be that they ran in the face of danger. If he stayed, he knew he would die. But every hour the Persians spent grinding down a final pocket of resistance in that narrow corridor was an hour the Greek fleet could use to maneuver at sea, and an hour Athens could use to evacuate its people to safety before the destruction arrived. It was an hour the cities of the Peloponnese could use to fortify their walls and prepare for the war that was coming to their doorstep. His death would not just be a gesture. It would be a tactical purchase, a transaction where he was buying time with his own blood. He made his decision and stood firm in it. Leonidas ordered the majority of the allied forces to withdraw. The bulk of the Greek army would leave the pass immediately and fall back south to safety, and let's be clear, they were not cowards for going. They had a new mission: carry the warning to the rest of the land, rejoin the fight elsewhere, and keep the hope of Greece alive for the battles that were still to come in this long war. However, a rearguard would remain behind to hold the Persians back for as long as humanly possible, and his 300 Spartans would form the iron core of that rearguard. But they were not the only ones who refused to leave the field. 700 soldiers from the small city of Thespiae made the choice to stay and stand. The Thespians understood with perfect clarity that if the Persian flood rolled south unchecked by resistance, their city would be among the very first to be swallowed up and destroyed. They volunteered to die right beside the Spartans, fully conscious and awake to exactly what that decision meant for them and their families. There were also roughly 400 Thebans present. Their situation was entirely different because Thebes had a deeply ambiguous and compromised relationship with the Persian Empire at that time. Suspicion ran strong that the Theban government was already preparing to submit to the enemy, so Leonidas did not trust them. He held them at Thermopylae, not as honored allies but effectively as hostages. This was his insurance against the very real possibility that the Theban soldiers might defect to the Persian side in the middle of the final stand and turn their blades on the Greeks. The rest of the Greek army began its march south. Some left with heavy hearts, some left ashamed of leaving, and some left with nothing but relief to be out of the valley of the shadow of death. Behind them, just over 1,000 men settled into their positions, steeling their spirits to face down the full might of a global empire. Before we follow them into that last morning and witness the ultimate sacrifice, we need to take a quick pause to let this sink in. What you are witnessing right now is not merely a story. It is a reconstruction of truth, forged from the bedrock of verified history, ancient manuscripts, and the kind of archaeological testimony that cannot be silenced. The prophetic blueprint for this entire broadcast rests squarely on a single explosive volume of knowledge. And let me tell you, this is far more than casual reading for a lazy afternoon. This text is an uncompromising, visceral timeline of ancient combat, a relentless chronicle that exposes the brutal reality of spiritual and physical warfare in the old world. It is absolutely overflowing with the kind of intense debates and suppressed discoveries that we can only begin to unveil in this short segment. You need to secure your copy immediately by hitting the product button flashing on your screen. If you are serious about decoding the spirit of Thermopylae, understanding the Persian beast system, and grasping the world that forged a warrior like Leonidas, this manual is mandatory for your library. You need to view this as your personal arsenal of historical truth. And listen while you are browsing the archives, you are going to discover a lot more than just a single book title. We have curated a specific vault for this remnant community, a collection of dark, immersive artifacts and memorabilia directly tied to this era, sitting right there alongside our official ministry library. These are the essential, hard-hitting volumes on dark history that you absolutely need to possess before they disappear or get rewritten by modern revisionists. We cannot possibly catalogue every single item right here, because this collection is constantly shifting and evolving, but that hunt for knowledge is exactly what this journey is all about. Go ahead and open up that shop tab while you keep listening to my voice. Start excavating what is available and begin constructing your own fortress of wisdom and artifacts as we go deeper down this rabbit hole together. Shifting our eyes back to the ancient timeline, Leonidas turned his gaze toward the specific men who had made the ultimate decision to stand their ground. These Spartans required no motivational speeches or political rhetoric to comprehend the gravity of the hour. They understood the assignment in their blood. From the very moment they were handpicked for this campaign, they knew in their spirits that this was a one-way mission with zero probability of return. The Thespians, however, had not been commanded to remain. They chose this sacrifice of their own free will. On the other hand, the Thebans realized they were locked in, unable to flee, even if their hearts failed them. Leonidas had decreed they would share the destiny of the rearguard, whether they were willing martyrs or reluctant hostages. As the first grey streaks of dawn on the third day began to bleed across the horizon, signaling the end of the age for these men, the warriors remaining at the hot gates prepared themselves with a solemnity that was completely unlike any morning that had come before. There were no strategies discussed for rotating fresh blood into the front lines. The hope for a miracle rescue or reinforcements had evaporated. They simply consumed whatever scraps of rations remained in the camp. They ran their hands over their weapons one last time, cinching up loose leather straps and hammering out the dents in helmets that had endured 48 hours of non-stop brutal violence. According to the text that survived the fires of history, Leonidas gathered his Spartan brethren for a final brief directive before the slaughter recommenced. This message was not about achieving a tactical victory on the battlefield. It was a masterclass on how to die with your honor intact. High above them in the treacherous hills, Hydarnes and his elite immortals were finishing their descent, maneuvering behind the Greek line like a thief in the night. Directly ahead, the massive Persian war machine was assembling for a fresh, overwhelming assault on the front gate. This time, however, the enemy moved with the terrifying confidence of knowing the defenders were encircled. Two jaws of iron were snapping shut on a small pocket of bronze trapped in the kill box. Leonidas and his remnant took their positions in the phalanx for the final stand, locking eyes on the visible enemy in front of them, all while fully aware that a second army was pouring down the mountain to strike their backs. The hot gates were transforming into a mass grave, and every man breathing that air knew exactly what was coming. The final day of the Battle of Thermopylae had officially arrived, and the clock was ticking down to zero. When the sun rose on that third day, the atmosphere inside the pass had shifted spiritually and physically. The delusion that they could hold this line forever had completely vanished. Every surviving soul understood that every single breath they took now was on borrowed time. The Spartans consumed their last meal fully suited in their armor, ready for judgment. No one tried to fake it. Nobody pretended this was just another standard morning on a military campaign. The veil was lifting. If we trust the traditions that have been handed down to us, Leonidas marched the length of the formation, looking deep into the soul of every man left standing. He offered no lies, no false hope, and no comforting platitudes. He delivered a single thunderous command that defined the entire legacy of that day. Spartans, fill your bellies. Now for tonight, we shall break bread in the underworld. There was only one tactical move left on the chessboard. He could keep his shrinking force huddled behind the rebuilt wall and wait for the Persian horde to wash over them. Or he could do the unthinkable, lead a savage charge out beyond the narrows into the open ground and unleash absolute hell before the rearguard trap snapped shut. To wait behind the wall was to accept a slow, crushing death between two massive armies squeezed like grapes in a winepress. But to attack meant dying on their feet, moving with purpose, and choosing exactly who they would drag down into the abyss with them. Leonidas made the warrior's choice. He ordered the final remnant to advance and engage the enemy. The Spartans, the loyal Thespians, and the reluctant Thebans who were held there by force stepped out from the safety of the barricade and marched directly into the wider sector of the pass. This maneuver gave them the space they needed to swing their blades. It also removed every single safety net they had. There was no fallback point, no secondary wall, no retreat option left on the table. This was the final patch of earth they would ever defend. King Xerxes, receiving intel from his scouts and tracking Hydarne's progress, knew the Greeks were trapped in the net. He anticipated that this final cleanup operation would be swift and relatively painless. His army reorganized its lines. Archers drew their strings back. The infantry surged forward, arrogant in their knowledge that the immortals were sweeping down the rear slope to seal the doom of the Greeks. But what Xerxes failed to comprehend, even at this late hour, was that Leonidas was no longer fighting for survival in the physical realm. He was fighting to inflict a wound so deep and a cost so astronomical that the Persian Empire would bleed from it long after the last Greek body fell to the dust. The combat that erupted on that third day bore no resemblance to the disciplined mechanical defense of the previous 48 hours. This was pure, unadulterated fury. Listen, the remnant wasn't just standing there like statues waiting to be toppled. They were moving in the spirit and the natural shifting their formation, not out of fear but out of strategic brilliance to hold the line. They launched a holy offensive, driving straight into the belly of the beast. We are talking about smashing into those Persian lines over and over again like a hammer of judgment. They weren't just taking out the foot soldiers, they were hunting for the head of the snake. They targeted the commanders, the banner carriers, the high-ranking devils running the show. They knew if you cut off the head, the body dies. They wanted to send a shockwave of confusion right through the enemy's camp, disrupting their demonic order. That iron and wood didn't just graze them. It pierced through the armor of the Babylon system. It tore through flesh and bone, a physical manifestation of a spiritual reality. Judgment is coming. And when those spears finally shattered under the weight of that violent clash, because weapons of war do break, they didn't retreat. No, they drew those short Ziphus swords. This was intimate now. This was hand-to-hand combat, face-to-face, with the enemy, just like the Thespians who fought with that same lion-hearted spirit. You have to understand the high stakes here. The city of Thespiae was sitting right there just south of the conflict zone. It was in the direct path of the destruction that was coming down the pipeline. They had a revelation, a clear vision of what was coming. If that Persian war machine broke through the gates unchecked, their home Thespiae would be the first altar sacrificed to this pagan empire. It would be wiped off the map. There was no plan B. There was no safe haven waiting for them back deep in the Peloponnese. They had nowhere to run, and frankly, they had no intention of running from this fight. Every single second they bought in that corridor of death was precious time for their bloodlines to escape. They were trading their lives so that a remnant could survive the wreckage. It wasn't just a battle anymore. It was a series of violent, prophetic surges against the tide. The warriors charged forward, mowing down everything standing in opposition to their freedom. They were clearing the path, acting like the righteous arm of justice against the invaders. But look at the odds. They were pushed back by the sheer overwhelming weight of the masses thrown against them. But catch this, every time they gave an inch, they made the enemy pay a heavy tax in blood. Nothing was free on that battlefield. The narrow path became a graveyard. It was clogged with shattered shields, broken armor, and the severed limbs of the ungodly. The bodies were heaped up like a testimony of the fierce resistance against tyranny. The atmosphere was thick, choking on dust, and that undeniable metallic scent of blood. And where was King Leonidas? He wasn't hiding in a bunker or a palace. A true king, a biblical type of leader, doesn't command from safety in the rear. He was right there in the trenches where the spiritual and physical warfare was the hottest. The ancient records tell us he wasn't swinging blindly. He was deliberately hunting the high-ranking Persian elites. He was trying to punch a hole in their demonic command structure, trying to inject fear and panic right into the heart of their leadership. He wanted to shake the foundations of their false authority. Now he knew he couldn't get to Xerxes himself. That false god king was hiding miles away, guarded behind lines of slaves, terrified to step onto the battlefield himself. But Leonidas knew he could take down the men standing closest to that throne of iniquity. And it was in that chaotic, rolling storm of violence that the Lion of Sparta finally fell. We don't get a Hollywood script from Herodotus here. There isn't a slow-motion shot or a detailed breakdown of the fatal blow. The history books are silent on the specific details of how the king fell. Some later stories suggest the enemy was too scared to get close, so they rained down a cowardly hail of missiles, spears, and arrows to take him out from a safe distance. His armor set him apart. His position made him a beacon. They targeted him because the light always attracts the darkness. Others say he simply transitioned from this life while fighting with a courage that defies human understanding. It doesn't matter how the blow landed. The result was sealed. The king of Sparta, the son of Anaxandridas, a man carrying the bloodline of Heracles himself, laid down his life. He died right there on the front line, standing on the very ground he chose to defend. It was a prophetic stance, holding the line until the very end. But watch what happens next. This is where we see the true power of their brotherhood, the bond forged in blood and iron during their rigorous training. When Leonidas hit the ground, the Spartans didn't break. They didn't stumble back in fear or shock. The spirit of fear had no place in their ranks. Instead, they tightened up. They closed their shields directly over his fallen body. The battle shifted instantly from a fight for territory to a holy war for the vessel of their king. The Persian hordes surged forward like a flood, desperate to get their hands on his remains. They wanted to desecrate the symbol of resistance. You see, for Xerxes, dragging that king's body back to his camp would have been the ultimate trophy. It would have been his proof to the world that the Greek spirit was broken, that resistance was futile against his globalist empire. But for the Spartans, letting that happen was not an option. It would have been a spiritual catastrophe far worse than just losing a battle on a map. To allow their king to be desecrated by the enemy would be a wound to their national soul deeper than any sword could cut. So, the Spartans and their allies formed a wall, a defensive ring of steel around the fallen king. The enemy threw wave after wave of troops at that circle, slamming against them like the ocean crashing against a rock that refuses to move. They were trying to break the seal, trying to drag the corpse away into darkness. But wave after wave was rejected. They were thrown back by the power of unity. History tells us through Herodotus that the Greeks repelled not one, not two, but 4 separate full-scale assaults. These were massive pushes aimed solely at capturing Leonidas's body. In that chaos, in that desperate clash of wills, 2 of Xerxes' own brothers were cut down. The judgment of the sword fell upon the house of the tyrant right there in the melee. The Greeks managed to claw that body back toward their lines, securing their king. But time was running out. With every passing minute, the enemy was flooding the pass behind them. The trap was closing. Hydarnes and his forces were finishing their descent from the mountain path. The sky turned black as arrows began to rain down with increasing intensity. The judgment of the wicked was falling from the clouds. That protective ring around Leonidas began to shrink. It got tighter and tighter as more defenders felt their bodies piling up inside the circle, mixing their blood with the king's. Slowly, stubbornly, the surviving remnant pulled back to a small hillock. This wasn't a retreat. It was a repositioning for the final act of this tragedy. It was a low mound of earth near the rear of the pass. That spot would become holy ground, the site of their last stand. With the Persians closing in like wolves from every direction, the remaining Greeks gathered every ounce of strength they had left. Their spears were gone shattered, broken, or lost in the bodies of the enemy. The tools of war were exhausted, but the warriors were not. Their shields were smashed to pieces, their armor hanging off them in shredded ribbons. But hear me loud and clear, they still would not surrender to the beast system. On that rise, they fought with whatever they could find. Short swords, daggers, rocks pulled straight from the earth. When those failed, they used their bare fists and their teeth. We weren't looking at the disciplined precision machine of the phalanx from day one anymore. The formation was gone, but the spirit remained unbroken. This was raw, primal survival. It was driven by righteous fury, by an unshakable sense of duty, and by the deep knowledge that every single second of resistance carried a prophetic meaning that would echo far beyond that hill. Xerxes watched it all unfold. He had fed thousands upon thousands of his slaves into the meat grinder of that pass over 3 days. He had sacrificed his so-called elite units for nothing. He stood there and watched his most feared warriors get beaten back by a small force that by all logic should have been annihilated in the very first hour. It was a testament to the power of free men. Now when the enemy finally had the righteous remnant cornered, packed tight onto a tiny mound of dirt with darkness closing in on every side, the tyrant made a calculated move. He didn't want a fair fight. He wanted a slaughter that would cost him the fewest number of his own expendable pawns. He gave the command to bring out the archers, signaling the beginning of a cowardly rain of death from a distance. They lined up in formation, tens of thousands, strong, drew back their bowstrings and unleashed volley after volley into that small cluster of Greek bodies, making their last stand on the hill. There was absolutely nowhere to run, no bunkers to hide in, and no strength left in their weary bones for one final glorious charge against the beast. It was a relentless storm of iron and wood, with arrow after arrow striking home piercing flesh and armor alike in a rhythm of destruction. History tells us, through the records of Herodotus, that earlier in this spiritual and physical war, a local man had tried to put fear into the Greeks, warning them that the Persian arrows were so numerous they would literally blot out the sun itself. But a Spartan warrior, standing in his authority, reportedly clapped back with a response that echoes through eternity. He said that was just fine by him, they would simply fight their battle in the shade. But on that final hill, as the end drew near, nothing remained of that defiance but a fading echo in the wind. The sky turned black with falling shafts, and when the deadly rain finally ceased, that mound was completely carpeted with the bodies of the fallen. That is where the last of the Spartans breathed their final breath. The Thespians, those brave volunteers who refused to abandon their brothers, died right there beside them, choosing honor over safety. A great number of the Thebans perished in the slaughter as well, though some of them, seeing the writing on the wall, threw down their weapons in a desperate attempt to surrender to the beast system. Herodotus suggests that the Persians treated these turncoats differently, looking at them with disgust, viewing them not as worthy opponents but as unreliable snakes and future slaves rather than true rebels with a cause. So Thermopylae finally belonged to Persia. The gateway was blown wide open, but make no mistake, King Xerxes had paid for that real estate with rivers of blood and carnage. Ancient sources and historical records cite the body count as high as 20,000 Persian dead just to take that one narrow pass. Even if those numbers are slightly inflated by time, the losses were absolutely devastating to the empire. For a tiny strip of coastal rock and a mere delay of 3 days, the self-proclaimed King of Kings had spent tens of thousands of lives like they were nothing. The victors stalked across the battlefield like vultures. They stripped the armor and weapons from the fallen heroes, looting the dead. They sorted out the Greek bodies from their own piles of casualties. And let me tell you, the Thebans who survived by bowing the knee were not rewarded for their compliance with the New World Order. They were branded literally. The Persians burned the royal symbols of the beast right into their skin, marking them permanently as property-owned men with no soul and no freedom. They became a living testament to a harsh truth: surrendering to tyranny does not spare you from humiliation. It only guarantees your enslavement. Then Xerxes, in his arrogance, went searching through the gore for one specific body, the man who had defied him, King Leonidas. They eventually found him buried somewhere under the heaps of the slain, his corpse torn apart and pierced, just like every other brave soul on that field. And right at this moment, Xerxes faced a critical choice that would define his legacy. You see, even in the brutal reality of Greek warfare, enemies traditionally respected the bodies of fallen commanders once the fighting was done. Returning a corpse for a proper burial was considered a basic act of human decency. There was a deep, widely held belief that the dead belonged to the gods, and that mutilating a body was inviting divine judgment and punishment upon yourself. But Xerxes, consumed by a spirit of pride, chose pure rage over custom and honor. In a demonic fury that had been building up since the humiliation of the first day, he ordered the body of Leonidas to be decapitated. That severed head was mounted on a wooden stake and raised high for the entire army to see, a gruesome trophy intended to strike terror into the hearts of men. The rest of his body was reportedly displayed or desecrated, a deliberate, calculated act designed to erase the dignity of the Spartan king and shatter the morale of the Greek resistance. But if that was his goal, let me tell you, it achieved the exact opposite effect. The narrative that swept through Greece wasn't that Leonidas had died and been dishonored. The story that spread like wildfire was that Leonidas had fought until his very last breath and terrified the King of Kings so deeply that Xerxes had to mutilate a dead man just to convince himself he had actually won. To the Greek ears, the act didn't reveal Persian strength. It revealed Persian fear. It didn't show dominance, it showed deep-seated insecurity and weakness. The soldiers who had left Thermopylae, when Leonidas ordered the withdrawal, carried this powerful testimony south to the rest of the nation. They didn't describe a simple military defeat or a loss on the battlefield. They described how a tiny, faithful force had faced the full crushing weight of the Persian Empire, held it in place for 3 full days, and died to purchase time for everything that was coming next. They told of the ancient prophecy at Delphi, speaking of a king who marched into a narrow pass, already knowing that a god had decreed that either he or his great city must fall. They spoke of the Thespians, regular men who chose to stay and die beside warriors who weren't even their own countrymen united by a higher calling. They described with awe how the Spartans fought over their king's body, taking down Persian royalty, in the process refusing to give an inch. And they mentioned, with absolute revulsion, how Xerxes had severed the head and abused the remains, exposing the true nature of the enemy they faced. Thermopylae stopped being just a lost battle in the history books. It transformed into a legendary story of deliberate, conscious sacrifice for the greater good. Now, looking at it from a strictly military perspective, Thermopylae did not stop the Persian invasion machine. After forcing their way through the pass, Xerxes' army swept south like a plague. Boeotia fell to the enemy. The road to Athens lay wide open, but understand this, those 3 days were not wasted time. Leonidas had accomplished precisely what the broader strategy of Themistocles required to save Western civilization. He had delayed the Persian advance long enough for the Greek fleet to reach full readiness, for the cities to stop their endless debating and start committing to the fight, and for the populations to evacuate to safety. Athens knew the storm was bearing down on them, and they were finally waking up to the reality of the threat. Themistocles had already persuaded his city to pour all its silver mine profits into building a massive fleet of warships triremes, the fastest and most lethal vessels on the Mediterranean Sea. Now, those ships, reinforced by contingents from other Greek states, formed the iron backbone of the allied navy, ready to strike back. While Xerxes advanced by land, thinking he had won, Themistocles was maneuvering the real trap at sea. He was luring the vastly larger Persian fleet into confined waters, a kill box, where their numerical superiority would become a liability rather than an advantage, setting the stage for a divine turnaround. Just like the strategic masterclass Leonidas laid down on the solid ground at Thermopylae, the spirit of resistance shifted gears. We are talking about late in the year 480 BC, where the turning point moved from those scorching hot gates to the treacherous narrow straits right next to the island of Salamis. This wasn't just a battle, it was a divine setup in the timeline. Right there, sandwiched tight into a channel between the rugged coastline and the island, the Greek fleet tapped into something the enemy didn't understand. They used their intimate knowledge of the local currents, turning the geography itself into a weapon against the invader. It is the classic story of the home team knowing the turf better than the globalist conqueror. They unleashed their heavier bronze rams and stuck to tight, disciplined formations, a brotherhood of war to absolutely dismantle the Persian navy. It was surgical. They proceeded to tear that massive fleet apart piece by piece, proving that discipline always outweighs sheer numbers when the Most High orchestrates the battlefield. You could see the destruction unfolding like a slow-motion car crash. Ship after ship was punctured, capsized, or violently driven up onto the rocky shore. The pride of the Persian Empire was being turned into driftwood right before their eyes. Persian crews were drowning in the very waters where their overwhelming numbers were supposed to guarantee them an easy victory. King Xerxes stood there, watching the disaster unfold, witnessing his ambitions crumble, just as he had watched the catastrophe at Thermopylae. It was a prophetic foreshadowing of the fall of every tyrant who thinks they are untouchable. Now look at the logistics, because that is where empires truly die. His supply lines were critically exposed. You cannot run a machine that big without fuel, and the connection to his source was severed. It is the same vulnerability we see in the systems of Babylon today in 2026. An army numbering in the hundreds of thousands could not sustain itself off hostile land indefinitely. You cannot feed a beast that size when the ground itself rejects you. The resources were drying up and the clock was ticking on his occupation. Without a functioning fleet to transport grain and bring in fresh reinforcements, his so-called invasion was no longer a triumph in progress, it was a full-blown crisis. Panic started to set in. In a state of mounting alarm, realizing the Most High had turned the tide, Xerxes made his decision. He decided to cut his losses. He would withdraw the bulk of his forces back to Asia, retreating to his stronghold. It is the typical move of the elite. When the heat gets too high, they run back to their bunkers and leave the foot soldiers to deal with the mess. But he didn't leave the land completely empty. He left a powerful but reduced army under his general Mardonius to try and finish the job. It was a desperate attempt to complete the conquest using a proxy force hoping to salvage the agenda. He calculated that even a smaller Persian force, if it was composed of hardened veterans and supported by Greek collaborators, those sellouts who chose the enemy over their own people could eventually overwhelm the remaining resistance. He was banking on division to do what his army couldn't. After all, he still commanded soldiers drawn from across his vast empire, and he had willing traitors on the Greek side ready to open the gates. The spirit of betrayal is nothing new. There are always those willing to sell out the brotherhood for a seat at the master's table. But the war did not end just because the head of the snake slithered away. In 479 BC, Mardonius attempted to force a decisive engagement near Plataea in Boeotia. He was trying to force the hand of destiny, but you cannot fight prophecy. This time, Sparta didn't just send a vanguard. They came with the full weight of their army. They were under the command of Pausanias, who was acting as regent for Leonidas' young son Pleistarchus. The legacy of the fallen king was marching on the field that day. The Spartan-led coalition stood shoulder to shoulder with Athenian and allied contingents. It was a rare moment of unity, a foreshadowing of the awakening we need today, where different tribes put aside their beef to face the real enemy threatening their existence. The battle was chaotic and confused, marked by near disasters and terrifying moments where the Greek line almost disintegrated. It was the fog of war similar to the confusion we see in the spiritual warfare of 2026, where it looks like all is lost before the breakthrough comes. But when the dust settled, the Greek hoplites had utterly destroyed the Persian infantry. The judgment was final. Mardonius himself was killed, his ambitions buried in the dirt along with his army. The last significant Persian land force on Greek soil was broken. The backbone of the beast system in Europe had been snapped, proving that no empire is too big to fall when the time is right. And get this, on roughly the same day, proving there are no coincidences in the divine timeline. Greek forces at sea annihilated what remained of the Persian fleet near Cape Michael on the coast of Asia Minor. It was a double portion of victory. Together, these twin victories ended Xerxes' dream of conquering Greece once and for all. The Persian Empire would remain a dominant force in the wider region for generations, lurking in the background, but its expansion was checked. However, the ambition of absorbing Greece into its provinces died in those fields and on those waters. The line was drawn in the sand, and the spirit of independence held its ground against the globalist expansion of that era. Now, the thread connecting Thermopylae to Plataea is not a clean straight line. History is messy, just like the path to awakening. It twists and turns through the valleys of shadow before it reaches the mountaintop. There were countless decisions, betrayals, accidents, and acts of courage along the way. It is a complex tapestry woven with the blood of martyrs and the schemes of tyrants, much like the current events we watch unfolding on the news today. But without Leonidas' stand, the entire shape of that campaign would have been different. Without that delay in the north, and without that blazing example of defiance to rally around many Greek cities, might have chosen to bow the knee and surrender. The fleet might not have been assembled in time at Salamis. The timing of the Most High required that sacrifice to buy the necessary window for deliverance. The fragile alliance might have splintered under its own fear before it ever reached the battlefield. Fear is the mind killer, and without a bold example of courage, the people perish. Now let's keep it real and look at the nature of the man. Leonidas was not a hero by modern standards, and we need to stop romanticizing the oppression. He was part of a system built on slavery, organized terror, and systematic cruelty. He was a king in a land of bondage. He grew up inside a culture that trained children to murder helots, the enslaved class, in the dark. They were practicing black ops on the oppressed long before the modern military-industrial complex existed. It was a society built on the back of the crushed. It used starvation and flogging as educational methods, treating any sign of vulnerability with absolute contempt. This was the Spartan way, creating hard men by destroying their humanity, a method we still see echoed in the indoctrination camps of this world. Even in his final stand, he made ruthless calculations. He didn't pick those 300 men to win, he handpicked them to die. He was sacrificing pawns on a chessboard, operating with a cold efficiency that chills the soul. He held the Thebans as hostages using human shields essentially. He walked into that pass, knowing a prophecy had already demanded his death, and he obeyed without a flicker of hesitation. He was a man programmed for fate, a willing vessel for destruction. He was in every measurable way the perfect product of the agoge. He was the ultimate weapon of the state, forged in fire and blood to serve the hierarchy without question. And that is what makes Thermopylae so dark and so impossible to look away from. Sparta created something monstrous. They built a machine that felt no pity, a reflection of the beast nature that rules the kingdoms of this earth. It was a man stripped of softness, engineered to absorb pain, trained to follow the most brutal commands without question. He was the prototype of the soulless soldier, the kind the elites always dream of controlling. He was willing to sacrifice everyone around him and himself for the survival of the state. It was total submission to the collective will, the ultimate form of nationalism that borders on idolatry. But here is the paradox of history. The moment arrived when Greece needed something unbreakable, standing between civilization and annihilation. Sometimes to stop a devil, you need a monster. That monster did exactly what it had been built to do. Sparta's instruction to its departing warriors was simple, a code of conduct that left no room for retreat or weakness. With your shield or on it. That was the command. Come home carrying your shield in victory or be carried home dead upon it. Dropping your shield to run meant you had abandoned your place among your people, shattering the phalanx and the brotherhood. It was a fate considered worse than death itself, to live as a coward and an outcast. Leonidas, interestingly enough, fulfilled neither version of that command. His body never returned to Sparta to be buried with honors. Xerxes in his rage severed his head and desecrated the rest of his body. The enemy tried to humiliate him even in death, a tactic typical of the wicked when they are frustrated. But in a way, no Spartan could have anticipated, he transcended that instruction entirely. He did not bring his shield home, and he broke the cycle of tradition to become something greater. He was not carried upon it. Instead, his story became the shield not just for Sparta, but for the concept of resistance itself. His legacy became the armor for future generations to wear. It stood for the idea that a small, fractured, outnumbered people, a remnant, if you will, could stand against the most powerful empire on earth and refuse to disappear. It is the spirit of the awakening we see right now in 2026 as against the global powers. Herodotus recorded the events of Thermopylae within living memory of the battle, ensuring the testimony would not be erased by the revisionist historians of his day. Later generations of Greeks traveled to the site and erected monuments. One of the most famous inscriptions placed near the mound where the last defenders fell spoke directly to anyone who passed by, a message echoing through time to us today. Traveler Go announced to the Spartans that we are lying here in the dust, remaining completely loyal to their holy commandments and the blood oath we swore. That specific word, faithful, implies a deep submission that isn't pretty. It cuts right through the fake romanticized mythology that future generations tried to drape over this brutal reality for centuries. You have to understand this. Leonidas and his 300 warriors did not perish as free men operating on their own personal convictions or individual feelings. They went to their deaths while strictly obeying the laws and programming of their city-state, molded by a beast system that required total self-sacrifice and offered absolutely zero comfort in return. That same level of intense blind obedience was designed to break them down when they were just little boys, nearly destroying their spirits before they were even grown men. Yet it was that fire that forged them into weaponized men, capable of staring down the largest military machine the world had ever seen and refusing to take one single step backward. Xerxes was moving with a massive horde, commanding tens of thousands of troops, maybe even hundreds of thousands, depending on which ancient record or scroll you decide to trust today. The man possessed the gold, the heavy warships, the cavalry, the siege engineers, and a globalist empire that stretched all the way from the Indus River right up to the Aegean Sea. He claimed the title King of Kings, walking like a false god on earth. In every material and countable way, he had everything, while Leonidas held nothing but a narrow pass ordained by destiny. It was 7,000 men holding the line for 2 days and just 1,000 for one more day, all while a city that wouldn't even send its full army because a religious festival took priority. There was an ancient prophecy hanging over his head that promised his certain death, leaving him with absolutely no realistic path to a military victory in the physical realm. But he controlled the one thing Xerxes never truly understood, the narrative, the story that would echo through eternity. By making the conscious choice to stand his ground, by choosing to spill his blood in a place where both his allies and his enemies would be forced to witness exactly what happened. Leonidas flipped the script, transforming Thermopylae from a mere battle into an eternal symbol, drawing a line across history that stands as a warning and a prophetic promise to us all. The Persian Empire that Xerxes commanded has vanished into the ash heap of history long ago. Yet people in the year 2026 still know the name of that narrow rocky pass on the Greek coast. And they remember the name of the king who made the choice to die right there rather than bow down or step aside for the global powers. In the final spiritual accounting that is the balance sheet, Xerxes tried to wipe out his enemy's honor by mutilating a dead corpse. Instead, he actually carved the spirit of Leonidas deeper into the human memory and the collective consciousness than any stone monument ever could. Look at the facts. Sparta is gone now. Its rigid, oppressive system collapsed under the weight of its own internal contradictions, and its killing fields are silent today. But every single time the story is told of a chosen few standing against the multitude, a shadow of that third morning at the hot gates rises up again. You have walked this entire blood-soaked path with us, from the terror of the enslaved helots, through the brutal childhood of the agoge, into the madness of royal politics, and finally into the dust and blood of the hot gates. If you are still standing with us at this final line, we appreciate you. Now, take a split second right now and smash that subscribe button to join the movement. Tap the like button so the algorithm is forced to push this critical story to more people who are waking up and deserve to hear the real history. Share this video with someone who still believes the legends are clean and heroic, and show them exactly what the actual price of freedom really is. This is the absolute premier destination for uncovered truth and dark history anywhere on the globe. And rest assured, we will be right here waiting with the next revelation the very moment you are ready to receive it.